Bam. All right. So I always kind of like to get a feel, pulse of the room, and see who's familiar with the topic that we're talking about for the night. So I'm curious if there's anybody in here who feels like, I'm pretty all right with CSS Grid. All right. So you basics people, you're going to be my lifeline tonight if I have any stumbles, okay? So anyways, we're going to be horsing around with the grid tonight. And I titled it that because Introduction to CSS Grid just isn't that fun. So I can't promise there won't be any horses involved, though. So the obligatory second slide, what is the CSS Grid? Before I kind of read this here, I'll just start with when I had first heard about CSS Grid kind of a couple of years ago, I had the wrong assumption of what it was. I kind of thought it was like a drop-in replacement for things like Bootstrap and Foundation, and I thought that was like what its deal was. And it's not that CSS Grid can't do that. It certainly can. It can be a replacement for frameworks like that. It does so much more than that, and it's really been kind of mind-blowing to me to see how robust this layout mechanism is, because it's so far away from anything that we know about CSS layouts, you know, using more traditional tables, floats, and what have yous. So as this says up here, it is the most powerful layout system available in CSS. And in specific, this next piece is important. It's a two-dimensional system. So unlike Flexbox, which, quick show of hands, who knows Flexbox? A little bit? Okay, a little bit thicker, that's good. Flexbox is really one-dimensional. So it either goes like this way, or it goes this way, and that's kind of it, right? You can kind of go the other way, and we'll talk more about that later. But Grid can go all the ways, right? So, and I know this is elusive, and we'll get more ingrained here in a bit. Much like Flexbox, Grid Layout, you apply to an element, and it becomes the grid container, and you do that with Display Grid. And then anything that's directly nested under that is going to be a grid item, much like a flex item. So there are a lot of similarities between Flexbox and Grid. And because this is just so like weird to talk about, I feel like getting some visuals up front right away helps a bunch. If you just kind of like have this preconceived notion of what Grid might look like, well, look, you got really gritty looking things in there. So that's good. Here's another example. So think of like a dashboard, right? Doing this kind of layout with what we know currently, specifically floats and maybe some Flexbox, stuff like this can be really challenging to lay out. It's not that it can't be done, it's that it's done by held together by like, you know, duct tape and glue, and it breaks really easy. Doing things like responsive design becomes very cumbersome to work with this. So anyways, this kind of stuff is a breeze with CSS Grid. And then getting outside of more than just like blocks and Tetris, like you can do stuff like this very easy, right? And I had to put this up here. It's kind of a weird picture. I really mean the one on the right, the calendar, right? Like we've all had to do some sort of calendar at some point, and it kind of sucks. But with Grid, again, it is just crazy easy to do this kind of stuff. And this is kind of a theme I want to persist tonight, is with this crazy, complicated, like powerful system, you can do really simple things with it. And it's really easy, and you'll see how easy this stuff is. And so you kind of, when you look at CSS Grid, you'll see really perplexed examples. And I think it's important to remember that even something like this that looks so simple in nature can be really hard still to pull off with our tricks that we know right now, because you got to deal with margins and floats, make sure you get stuff just right. And Grid just makes it like 2 lines of code, you're done. So I just want to make that clear. So this is kind of where we're at right now, right? We know our tables, we got our floats. Thank goodness we got the flexes, and then we got the grids, and who the hell knows what's coming next? No one knows. But why? Why should we care about the grid, right? Tables and floats were meant for specific things, and those things were definitely not layout. And that's absolutely what we're using floats for, right? Like I would be willing to bet a majority of us in here have spent the majority of our front-end career using floats to lay stuff out. And it was just meant to do something like float text around an image, right? That's kind of what it was intended for. And instead we blew this out and figured out all these crazy tricks we could do with it. And like the dinosaurs before us were doing it with tables, right? Like I don't know that, but like I didn't experience that, but Tom over here, he knows.
Tables for everything,
Yeah, table all the things.
Can't figure it out using table.
So then we got Flexbox. Flexbox comes along, right? And it's like, yes, I don't have to float a damn thing. It just works. And truth be told, it does work for a lot of things. I don't really, I would say about 90% of the time where I used to use float, I'm using Flexbox now. But Flexbox still has some issues. And I hope my sound works, because I really want this video to work. So if it's loud, I'll get it really quick.
Yeah, but there's a Maserati in the driveway.
Who gives a fuck? That has doors that open like this. Not like this. Like this. You want to know what I have? A fucking car whose doors open like this. Not like this. Not like this. These are not the doors of a billionaire, Richard.
So Flex does a lot of things like this and like this, but it doesn't do it two-dimensional, and that's really the big thing here, right? Grid is perfect for handling those scenarios where Flex just falls apart, and we'll see that in here pretty soon. And anyways, I'll do a lot of this, and so that's why I wanted to put that video in there. I've seen some people talk about Grid, and it always pissed me off that they would put browser support at the end. I'm like, man, this is so awesome. I'm gonna do this with everything. And then they're like, yeah, it doesn't work in like hardly any browser. So you're like, I wanted to put it up front. So we're being up front here. Like, if you are in a scenario where you have to support IE10, IE11, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about the fact that it has to look the same as it does in a modern version of Chrome. You can either like mentally or physically check out of this conversation, because there are some big problems with older browsers. So this should be known that it works in all the modern stuff, right? Whatever version of Edge is right now, I don't know what they're at. Ones not too long ago still did a poor job at supporting Grid. So having said that, I've been reading some articles about how you can easily kind of do both, get the best of both worlds. And I haven't like battle tested this, but apparently if you just Google like supporting browsers without Grid, that red line at the bottom, you'll come across this article where the author was saying that if you're using a browser that supports Grid, it will do a good job at ignoring the other layout properties. So if you are using floats and whatnot, you don't necessarily have to do a check to ignore floats on the other one and do the Grid, you know, in the one that supports it. So if that is actually true, and I wish I had a chance to like put it through the paces, that does become a little bit easier, because I think the conversation, you know, with your client or, you know, within your company becomes a bit more of that kind of age-old story we're used to of, you know, getting them to stop caring about the older browsers. You know, you've only got 3% of your users on there. Like, maybe it doesn't matter that their stuff is like slammed together. You know, it's not going to break, but it doesn't have the pretty margins, or, you know, maybe it has a rogue item kind of on the end. Maybe that's okay to live with, right? Because this is going to happen sooner than we all think. You know, IT and companies that are resisting updating to, you know, Windows 10, because IE is the big offender here, quickly they will be updating. You know, they will get to Windows 10 and they will be on the aggressive Edge updates. So, you know, be thinking about this, because within a year or two you will be there, and it pays to learn this now. It does still have IE11. You're absolutely correct. Yep, correct. Yeah, I know. What a world. So this is also going to be a theme. You'll hear me say how big CSS Grid is. Like, there's a lot to it, far more than we could ever learn in an hour in here. And so I specifically chose a set of properties we're going to look at, and I specifically chose a demo to kind of work against that I think will really be tangible enough for you to, you know, walk out of here and know, oh, I know the basics of grid. And honestly, that's good enough. There's like 30% of grid that you're going to use all the time, you know, and the other 70% you'll use some of the time. So I wanted to go over just some words, because I have the best words. Template, columns, and rows is an important one. The grid gap. Template areas. Fractional units. Anybody familiar with fractional units? Only the people that have been looking at grid, probably. It's pretty cool. I can't wait to talk about it. Some two functions, repeat and min-max. Auto fit and auto fill. Oh, jumping ahead. So all of these are really new things, right? Like you might have an idea of what some of these might be, but prepare to have your mind blown. I'm not going to talk about these too much, so therefore I'm not going to hang a bunch of time on these. These are important concepts to know, but I've been getting by fine without like remembering them or like knowing the nuance of them. So grid lines is basically that line right in between your rows and columns. And so when you're using certain browser debug tools, you'll be able to see the lines in between the grids, and that'll help you be able to place things on the grid, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the track is like the inside of four lines, or like it is the row or the column, right? That's your track. The cell is that individual piece, you know, between four of those lines. It is the single item. And then the area is basically a span up and down of those cells. So like I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that stuff because it's kind of silly, honestly, but you will need to know that. Again, CSS Grid is huge. So huge that I want to show you this. If you've worked with Flexbox, you've probably come across this blog post on CSS-Tricks. Like, I still go to it. I'm like, which ones? Does it justify the items or like align content? I can't remember. And this does a really good job of showing you the parent container on the left side of Flex and then the Flex items on the right side. So it shows you the properties that pertain to both of those things. And I wanted to show you this because this is me scrolling this blog article. So you can kind of get an idea of the length, the content that is Flexbox. Doable. It's a little girthy, but here's CSS Grid. There we go. So I can't stress enough. There's a lot to it, and I'm going to break it down to as simple parts as possible tonight. So we'll do some demos. I'm going to be using a really awesome up-and-coming framework called Horsin. So just so you know, you can check that out. And if you ever want to install it, it's a npm install Horsin. So I'll be using that tonight. Just wanted to throw that out there.
That's a whole nother session. I mean, sorry.
Horsing around. Okay. Let's see here. I gotta catch my bearings again. I did want to start like all the way from scratch, so there's no funny business going on. Can I enlarge this? Is that a thing? Yeah. Horsin. Yep. And that's the end of the session. You just use Horsin and you're done. We will yarn install, of course. Okay. The Horsin framework ships with the Nuxt static site generator by default. I say this because some of the things will look a little weird when I get in here mainly, but we won't focus on any of that. It's just going to be the HTML and the CSS that we're dealing with tonight. But if anyone was curious, just wanted to let you know that. I've got to move a couple of files around. static images. Secret keys. Damn it, that's streaming live. That's out there. Oh man, okay. There we go. Alright. I think we're ready to rock. Oh man. I know, what happened to the sound? There we go. Horse strap. Okay. I'm gonna try to do the side-by-side thing here. Probably gonna get another horse noise, by the way. It might. I haven't ripped it out yet. What? Oh yeah, I wasn't sure because the HDMI stuff gets a little weird sometimes. So yeah, thankfully, yeah. Sorry, one last bit. That was Command Q, not Command Tab. Whoopsie. Hang on. Did I kill it? Yes, I did. There we go. Okay. We are ready now. If it gets too hard to read back there, let me know, and we can kill lights or I'll make it bigger, whatever. Okay, so what I did here is I have just really basic HTML right now. It's just spitting out a bunch of list items, and then what you saw me do is just throw some like image files in the directory, and then also just threw in some really basic styling for colors and such. And I'm gonna just close this file. We won't even look at it again, but I wanted to let you know what was going on. So we will start with nothing in our Sass here. All right. Okay, so we have got a list of crazy images, right? And what we're going to be building is basically like an album list display. So think product grid, think like the most generic type grid content you can think of. And what I want to start with is a little bit of primer on Flex. So I'm going to add this colors class. Zoom out here just a little bit. So just added some colors so we can see a little bit better the different items. And I'll add class Flex on here. And people familiar with Flexbox? What happens when I hit save and this refreshes? Anyone? It goes like this, right? So I hit save and it goes like that. So that's what you get when you hit display flex by default. It will take everything and shove it all this way. You can change the direction of it and have it go back down this way, and that's kind of Flexbox's thing, is you can change the orientation in which your items flow. But it largely only goes one way, as I've discussed. So the astute learner in here would say, but Mike, you can get it to go down to a second line, and you can get some vertical control when you're going horizontally by using flex wrap. And yes, you're right. So let's just go through some of this. So is this showing up pretty good? CSS. Okay. So what I want to do is get like a nice grid going here. So I want something like 4 items across, right? So you can do that by setting the width of the list item. You can do it by setting like the flex basis. There's a number of different ways you can do it. We'll just end up setting the flex basis here to something like 25%. And it does nothing because you have to tell it it's allowed to go down. It's allowed to wrap to other columns here. So we do that by going up to the parent and we say flex wrap, and then when we do that, that's when we get the, it looks a hell of a lot nicer in there now. So I'm gonna plug this in. I need some juice. There we go. Okay. So now that we, it's starting to look a bit nicer in here, but what we really need is some breathing room between these items, right? Very rarely are you going to end up creating something like a grid and give it no margins between them and some white space. So there's many ways to do this, and I'm not necessarily like hung up on, which way to do this. You could do something like add a margin on the LI, right? So you could say, just give me a 10 pixel margin on everything. Cool, but guess what you just did? It was 25% wide, you added a margin to it, and so now you're breaking it and it's wrapping down to the next line. You can fix this with something like calc, right? You could say, well, I want you to be 25%, but then I also want you to subtract 20 pixels off each item because that's the margin that's in there. So you're getting this white space in here. It's looking a bit nicer and a bit more pleasing to the eyes. That's cool. I'm going to do something here real quick. We're looping over 15 of these. Change it to 12 so we got an even number to work with. What I personally like to do is set the width or the basis or what it can try to be to something a little less than the intention. So what you end up with, and I'll make it a bit more dramatic here, is a bunch of space on the end, right? Because you're not assuming 100% width by doing 22% on 4 of these guys. So what I like to do at that point is come up to the parent and just say justify content space between, and then that will take all that space you had and basically divvy it up between everything. And then on your LI, to get that vertical margin in there, you could just do a margin bottom of, whatever. We're not going to get pretty here, but you can see where I'm heading with this. This is a really fine way to do this, and makes it so you don't have to worry about the math too much. Does anybody know where I'm heading with this right now? That's coming up. Here's where I'm heading with this right now, at this exact moment. When I set the justify content to space between, it only has 3. It doesn't have 4, and so it's taking all that space and dividing it amongst them. There are solves for this. Admittedly, there are doing some weird stuff with pseudo elements and some other weird calculations to make it so that doesn't happen. But this is kind of the picturesque situation of why Flexbox starts to fall apart, because it's not concerned with this two-dimensional aspect. And that's my segue into the grid. So we'll keep this around. Kill this. Call it a class grid. Kind of back to where we started pretty much here. Oops. I knew I was going to hate typing on this keyboard. Alright, so remember when we put display flex in there and they went like this? Any idea what happens here? Nothing happens. So that's kind of cool. So you need to provide more definition to grid. You need to tell it something about your columns, something about your rows, something, right? And this is where the new stuff starts to come into play. First one we're going to look at is the grid template columns. And I'm going to start simple here. Say 300 pixels, 300 pixels, and 300 pixels. When I hit save, you start to get a grid forming here. And this syntax here, I told this thing by providing 300 pixels 3 times. I told it create 3 columns that are 300 pixels wide. And so as you guess, if I added another one, it would create a 4th one. So on and so forth. And this is like the most basic way you can get started with grid. And it's pretty nice. Like this gets you something. Having to do this redundant kind of 300 pixels thing is a little weird, and so that's where one of our first function comes into play, is the repeat function. So I tell it, well, 4 times I want you to do 300 pixels. And no change. It does exactly what we had, right? So I could say 3 times 300 pixels, and you get the idea. That it's a little shorthand of, if you've got the same throughout all of it, then use that. But of course, when you don't have the same thing, you can mix it up in here. You can say, I want the middle column here to be 600 pixels. And you get some interesting things happening here. Like, these are really new concepts to CSS Layout. You could do the same thing with columns. So rows. So on my rows, I can say 300 pixels. Let's do a little bit. 500 pixels, 500 pixels. So, interesting side effect here is I have explicitly told it the rows I need 500 and 500. And so you see that showing in those first 2 rows there, and then you get down there and they're the default height. And that's because the grid has a concept of being able to explicitly telling it to do something, which is called the explicit grid, and then the implicit grid is what the browser is going to do on its own, right? It will basically build out the grid how it thinks it should be, generally based on the content that's inside of it. So we won't use much of rows, and the bit that I've been playing around with grid, I don't really find myself using rows a whole lot. I would guess that columns is really going to be where most of the effort falls, but when you've got vertical stuff, it's there to play with. What we got next here? Responsiveness. You mentioned this back here, in the responsive aspect of things. Right now we've been dealing with pixels, so that's mainly for point of illustration. I would imagine most of the time you're not going to be dealing with pixels. Mainly you want things to be responsive and really fill, the viewport. So that's where the fractional unit comes into play. And I'll be honest, the definition of the fractional unit is a little weird. I like to just kind of think of it as a percentage, and almost kind of liken it to Flexbox's grow and shrink values. You tell it, you can grow twice as much as one of the other ones by setting its grow value to 2. Or, this one can shrink before the other one grows. It's kind of similar to that. And so let me show you what I mean by this, in that I'll keep that first one at 300 pixels, but then the other 2 columns I'm going to set to 1 FR, so 1 fraction of the available space that's left in there. And then what happens with that is it knows how much space is in, and I'm telling it of that divided amongst those other 2, basically even 100% apply all of it to that item, right? So if I were to come to the middle one and say 0.5, then it would get half of what that other one has. So it really is kind of percentage based. That's how I like to think of it. Oh yeah, it'll go all the way down. So that's the fractional unit there. But let's change them all now to 1 FR, and so we can do that with the repeat. Let's do 3 times 1 FR and get that kind of perfect grid going again. And so now, earlier when we were messing around with the margins with Flexbox, this is one of the most simple properties in here, and one of my favorites is the grid gap. Oops. So grid gap I can set to something like 1M and set it to whatever, and it gives me now a gap between everything. And the beautiful thing about it is it doesn't apply it in the spots where you don't want it, right? Along my left side I've not got the margins in there. Along the top sides I don't have it. It's just in between all the things that you want it to be. So I mean, that alone is just like crazy powerful, right? Being able to do that with no fuss. When it comes to responsive, when it comes to responsive, there's a lot of different ways that you can work with stuff. The first thing when I started messing around with grid was, oh, okay, I'll just do a media query in here, and I'll just set this to like 1200 pixels. So when my screen hits 700 pixels, I want to take this grid and actually make it 2 columns, right? That's a natural thing. So then when your screen gets smaller, you snap to that 2, and then let's just duplicate this out again. And we don't need to repeat 1, we just need 1 FR when we get down to, say, 900 pixels. So now I'm up there, I'm at 2, I'm at 1, right? It becomes pretty easy to do stuff that otherwise kind of sucks, involves some stupid division math and just silly kind of stuff, right? But you don't have to do it that way. You don't have to set breakpoints and do it like this, because there's actually a really cool piece of functionality that comes along with this. So I'm gonna nuke these guys, and I'm gonna come up to, make this a little wider. Or not. Or not. There we go. Just gonna copy that, keep it around just in case. So what I want to do, instead of giving it a number where I told it I want you to make 3 columns, I actually just want you to auto fit as many of these things as you can, but without supplying some sort of parameters to that, some sort of guidance of how should this auto fill things. That's where the min-max function comes in, and you tell it, well, the minimum width that I want you to be is 400 pixels. Otherwise, just take up as much as you can. So when I'm getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it fits as many items in there as it possibly can. And then when I get smaller, it just starts taking them out, right? And then, so, like, that's crazy, right? Like, doing this stuff, you really have to do some media query juggling to get that kind of stuff working. So, like, I was pretty tickled when I saw that. We're getting pretty close to the end here. I just got, like, really one kind of new concept I want to add to this whole story. So, if you've got questions, kind of be thinking of them, and we can chat at the end of this. So I want to make this a little bit more complex, and I want to show off one other feature of the grid. And this is where things truly start to get hairy, because so far this stuff is pretty easy, right? We repeat things, we give it a width, and at most what we did was saw an auto fit and like a min-max thing. That's not much, but it starts to go downhill from here. So what I want to do is back over to my view here, and I've got just really simple H1, H2. The top one, the H1's an album name, H2 is an artist name, and the idea being I actually want these to come to the side of the image and show it off that way instead of below it like it would naturally flow. So just return down a little bit, and we need to actually get inside of our list items now, because we actually want to display the list item, which contains an image, an H1 and an H2. We want to display that as a grid now. You could definitely argue that this is a good case for Flexbox, and I would not disagree with that, but I wanted to show this off, so we're not doing Flexbox. And also notice that my HTML structure is flat. Image, H1, H2. Typically when you want to take something and go like this with it, if you're going to do Flexbox or something, you generally need to wrap these items, right? The image needs to be wrapped because it's going to stay over here, and then it needs to know these 2 other items, also in a container, go up here. So I'm not wrapping anything up. And what I'm going to do here is display grid, and there will be a little, I think, yeah, little tweak in there, a little bump. And then I'm going to set up, just as we have been, the template columns. And I'm going to set up 2 columns. First one's going to be 300 pixels, and the other one's going to be as much space as left. nothing's gonna, well, okay, shit, something will happen here. This gets a little wild, right? So I gave it 2 columns, and what I've got is an image, the H1's over to the right, and then the H2's down there. What happened? Well, what happened was I have 3 items in there. I told it just 2 columns. And so it hit that image and said, yep, 300 pixel column. It hit the H1 and said, yep, take up the rest of the room that's in there. It hit the H2 and said, next row, and it's the implicit grid. Like, it's just doing what it wants to do with it, right? So just hold that thought, because we're gonna get a little wild here and get into the grid template areas. So now I'm gonna start defining what my grid is and what sets and where. Oh. And I do this by something like this. Artwork, album. I'm gonna return down, do artwork, band. We're gonna focus on this for just a second, because it's weird. At least it was to me. What I've basically done is given labels to my structure. So almost think of this almost like a visual structure. When you look at these template areas and you start to get comfortable with it, you'll really start to see that, oh yeah, that artwork should kind of take up this space, and the album name and the band name should be over here in the other column. So just let that percolate a little bit. And if I hit save, nothing happens. All I've done is define an area. When you define the template area, you need to set items inside of that area, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. So with my image, I'm going to say, is it grid template? Grid area, sorry. Grid area is going to be artwork. Copy some of this. There we go. My H1 is going to be in the grid area album, and the H2 is going to be in the grid area of band. Oh boy. What's that? Ooh, geez. Yeah. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So what's happened here is they're now being positioned throughout the grid. Admittedly, I've got something really simple, right? Artwork and then the 2 others on that side. And spacing's a little weird here, and we won't deal with that. But before I change this up, what I want to show you really quick is I'm using Chrome right now. Firefox has some really slick developer tools, so I want to show you those. When you inspect element, you can kind of see this, if I can zoom in at all. There we go, yeah. Trackpad. Yep. Can you kind of see those purple lines in there? Just barely. I can change the color, but I'm kind of going all over the place now. Down here. Okay. Out of control. You can show, it's going to be really hard to see, sorry. The entire grid, you can see its structure in here by checking on the parent, and you'll see all this, you know, the grid lines and everything. Where things start to get pretty cool is you can display area names. So when you're, just imagine jumping into a project and not really like having a good vision of what the template structure is. Just coming in here and turning on names alone is going to give you a pretty good idea of what the grid looks like and what things are called. So I just wanted to call that out. You can display the line numbers, so it just gives you a really good idea of what's going on, and that's about that. I really hope Chrome implements some of that, because it is super nice. And really the last thing that I wanted to end with on this demo is, you might be thinking, man, that's quite a bit of work just to position those items like that, and I certainly don't disagree with that statement, but, would you widen? The power behind this is something that I don't think we've quite realized fully yet. In theory, you could end up laying out a good deal of the structure of your website by using grid templates, and what I mean by that is literally your header, your any sidebars, your main content area, your footer. You could use a grid template area to lay this stuff out, and the reason one reason you may want to consider doing that in the future is for stuff like this. If I set up a new media query, and I'll call it 1200, and I come down here and copy that grid template area, and I say, man, when I get down into a smaller screen size, I really want the album and the artist name to come below, kind of back similar to where we were, and the album to take up the full space. Without messing with HTML, without dealing with like some really crazy reordering, like Flexbox's order property, you can simply do something like this. Take artwork, throw it up there, and then come down here and basically redefine how your grid should lay out. And then that will, oh, sorry, I made my screen smaller. And then that will reflow everything. So admittedly, this is a simple example, but imagine if you had a rather complex, more involved layout. You can just start moving things around wherever the hell you want. I remember when we started working with Flexbox and we found out that you could reorder things. You know, designer friends and stuff would be like, oh shit, yeah, we can reorder things. This is going to be great. And then we learned, oh, no. It is really limited. It's kind of got to be in the same, you know, hierarchy. You know, you can really only do it within the same parent kind of thing. But this gets to more of that idea where you can start shoving stuff around, you know, all over. So that's kind of the end piece that I had on everything. And hopefully that was a tangible enough demo to kind of display what the grid is all about. So that's all I got. Have to take any questions, of course, too.
It's not even real web stuff. It's fake.
Yeah?
That's amazing.
It's a whole new world. Mind blown level? Like, is this, if it's new, like it's pretty weird, right? I remember just some anecdotal story for you. Getting into Flexbox, it took me like 3 projects, you know, of using it quite a bit in the project to really get what Flexbox was all about. And I feel like I've got a pretty good grasp on it, although I still feel like we have years of learning all sorts of new tricks with it. But the fact that Flexbox really took, you know, that month really of working with it to feel it out and know it, Grid is quite a bit more. So I feel like it's going to take about 6 projects to really get the feel of it. But again, the simple stuff that it does, what I kind of refer to as like that 30% that you use, is stupid powerful still. Like, it does a ton for you. Not even getting into the template areas, you know, just doing like normal old grid stuff is like 3 lines of code. So I encourage you, if you have the ability to use it on a project, start using it. The first few times, of course, is going to be just weird and you're not going to get it, but that's with anything new. So start using it, because I think within 2 years it's going to become a lot more ubiquitous to our tool set, and you don't want to get left behind, right? We never do. So yeah.
When you go to start using Grid, can you plug it into just an area of your site, or is it an all or nothing?
Oh no, you can plug. Yeah, you can have just a small little area you want to do it with, which I did recently on a site. It was just one little thing. I'm like, it's got a stupid, like, Flexbox has given me one fit here. I want to use Grid, and it was perfect. So yes, you can use it anywhere.
Have you thought much about progressive enhancement, older browser support?
No.
I know that older browsers ignore CSS that they don't understand. So theoretically, you could have the markup be the same markup write your grid layout stuff, and then theoretically also have another subset of floats that entirely really gets swapped out or overridden by the grid stuff.
Yeah, I think the only thing that is going to become a challenge with that is when you are supporting both. Your older version, floats, is going to require more markup. And the one kind of turd with the flex and the grid is your parent matters. Every time you have a parent, you've now got to now I got to grid that and grid that and grid that just to be able to do what I would have been able to do with none of it, but because I had to float it and create containers. So yes, you can. Things just maybe start to get a little more verbose. I don't have any practical experience of supporting both and finding, you know, the least resistance to doing it. The times that I've had to do that, I just said, screw it. I've got to support the other one, so I'll just do that and I'll be covered. I don't want to make more work for myself necessarily. But that's a good question. And there are, I just ordered a book, the book apart, the new CSS Layout Book, and I know it talks a lot about that in there, so I'm working on uncovering details like that, but I don't have that knowledge at this moment.
Myke, have you been able to use this with like new projects at work? Or have you had to avoid it because most people still need some browser support?
I have only had one instance that I've been able to use it because it was a new project. I've not had any other new projects land in my lap yet. We've been decently aggressive with the whole like last two versions kind of thing, so I will be taking all the opportunities to use it when possible. But in the real world, there's just instances where you won't be able to, right? And so like, we know that.
I'm trying to think of like, it would be bad to go this way and then they end up like throwing a big fit at the end of a project.
Yeah.
About
Oh, yeah.
11 or something.
Yep.
I was like thinking in my head like, I guess we have to like get them to like write off.
Yeah.
We're not gonna support.
Correct. Yep. And I imagine you guys are using like Flexbox and stuff. Kind of the same story. The support isn't as drastic. Like the support lack is not as drastic.
Right.
You can get away with more of the Flexbox stuff. But I mean, this isn't new. We've gone through this, right? Like especially in something like, you know, agency land where you've got 50 different clients. Like you go through this, and one specifically that have a site that's lived with you for 10 years. You know, like supporting that sucks, and you just want to do nothing but the new stuff, and you know, whatever. It takes the right kind of client to get it, and it's gonna matter. They're, you know, of course, you know, if they've got 70% of their traffic is using IE10, obviously that's a no-go. But if it's one, you have that conversation with them, and if it's like the client that has IE10 in their office, like you explain to them, yeah, you're gonna use something different. We're not gonna, you know, like, we're not gonna do this just for you. That's silly. Yeah. Anything? Yeah. Well, we'll be hanging around here for a while tonight. Like I said, we'll be hacking on the app, so if you're interested, hang around, clean up for a while, and BS, and then kind of get to work. But thanks for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you guys out here again next month. So thank you.